cull wagon was already at my fence when the sun came up over the scarn flats, and the old hound was already standing in my gate, refusing to let it through. Two Huron handlers stood in the bed of the wagon with prod poles they clearly did not want to use, and the hound, gray down the muzzle he chewed to a stub, shoulders like a load-bearing wall gone slightly out of true, stood square in the gateway with his head low and his eyes on them, not making a sound. I came out onto the porch with my coffee because a man should not face Huron paperwork without coffee. The morning wind was coming down off the burn ridges, dry and carrying ash, and the wagon stock cage rattled in it, empty. They had come to fill it. Human crane. The taller handler had the rank cords of a second leash, which on Veska's reach meant he was somebody's nephew. His translator collar flattened his voice into something polite and bloodless. You are harboring expired stock of Denhold Caruth. The Vethrek-designated K7 Echo is listed for cull. Stand it down. He's standing in my gate, I said, on my land, eating my grazer culls and keeping the ridge runners off my fence line all winter. The way I read the Frontier Compact, that makes him salvage, same as a dropped cargo pod. He is not a cargo pod. No, I agreed. A cargo pod never once walked a fence at 3 in the morning so an old man could sleep. The hound did not look back at me. He never did during these conversations. He watched the prod poles the way a foreman watches a crew he doesn't trust, and the handlers watched him back with that particular Huron stillness that isn't calm at all, just fear wearing a uniform. They are a predator culture, the Huron. 7 feet of plated hide and tusk, raised from the den to handle war stock, and every one of them stood in that wagon like the floor, was the only safe territory left in the world. That told you everything about what a Vethrek was. Even an old one. Even a culled one. The second leash tried again. Beastmaster Corveth is en route. He carries den authority. If the animal resists collection, we are sanctioned to use the poles. You're sanctioned to try, I said, and drank my coffee. I want to be honest about what the hound was to me, because the Huron got it wrong all that morning and most of that week. I had not tamed him. You don't tame a Vethrek the same way you don't tame weather. 8 months back, in the gray end of winter, he had come down off the ridge with a snare cable wound into his foreleg so deep the wire had gone green, dragging the stake behind him, and he had stood at the edge of my light with his head down, bleeding, and looked at me, not begging. I was 63 years old. I had spent 30 years in orbital infantry watching things measure me, and I knew the look. I got the cable cutters and the antiseptic, and I talked the whole time about nothing, the way you do, and he let me work on him for 40 minutes with his teeth 4 inches from my wrist and never once raised a lip. When it was done, he slept in my equipment shed for 9 days. Then he started walking the fence. We had been splitting the work of the farm ever since, like 2 old men who don't need to discuss the arrangement. The skimmer came in from the north at 1:15 sunup, fast and low, fanning ash off the flats, and Beastmaster Corveth Densarl stepped off it before it had fully settled. I'd met him twice at the seasonal markets. He was big even for a Huron, plated-in handler armor he no longer worked in, tusk-capped in Den Silver, and he carried his authority the way some men carry a weapon they've never had to fire, out in front where everyone could see it. There it is, he said to the handlers, not to me. 8 seasons past prime, lame in the off 4, refusing collection at a human dirt farm. You see why the line is culled Tessic, sentiment in the stock. Weakness travels down the blood. His eyes came around to me last, the way you'd address the fence post after the fence. Human, you are interfering with den property. I'm drinking coffee on my porch, I said. He's the one interfering. Take it up with him. A couple of the handlers looked at each other. The young one, Tessic, slighter than the rest, rank cords of a first leash and chewed down to the knot, was watching the hound with an expression I hadn't seen on a Huron before. Not fear. Arithmetic. He was counting the scars on that gray hide and coming up with a number that didn't match the word expired. Corveth took the lead pole himself. That was the kind of beastmaster he was. He would do the thing badly in front of his own people rather than let them see him not do it. He came through the gate space sideways, pole leveled, working an approach pattern that probably scored well in the den academies, and the old hound turned his head and looked at him. That was all. Looked at him. But I felt it from the porch, the way you feel a generator kick on through your boot soles. The wind moved the ash, and nobody else moved anything. Easy, I said, quietly to the hound around the coffee. He's not worth your mourning. The hound's posture came down maybe 2 degrees. The pole stopped where it was. And every Huron in that wagon saw what had just happened. Saw 800 pounds of culled warstock stand down off a kill posture because an old human in a frayed work coat said 6 words into a coffee cup, and Corveth saw them see it. And that, I think, is the exact moment he started hating me, because his own pole had not moved that animal an inch, and my voice had moved him 2 degrees. And there were witnesses. Sanction the poles, Corveth said. All of them now. It never got tested. The siren got there first. It came across the flats from the northeast, from the direction of Denhold Carruth, 15 kilometers off behind its ridge, a sound I'd never heard the hold make in 6 years of being its neighbor. 3 rising tones and a flat one, over and over, thin with distance, ugly as a bone breaking. Every hearing in the wagon went rigid at once, in unison, like the sound had pulled a wire through all of them. Corvath's comm started talking before he reached for it. I couldn't follow the Huron, but I didn't need the words. I'd stood in enough operations rooms to know the sound of a perimeter gone, of overlapping voices stepping on each other, of somebody too young repeating the same phrase too fast. Tessick translated without being asked, maybe without realizing he was doing it, his collar throwing the words flat into the wind. Breach at the hold. The east pens are open. He stopped, listened, started again. Vark. Ridge runners. A wild pack came through the burn line. Inside the wire. Inside the pens, his head came around toward the ridge, where the smoke from the seasonal burns had been standing all week like a held breath. They're in among the stock. The prime string broke harness and scattered. Beastmaster, the nursery pens. The pups are in the nursery pens and the gate beast is down. For one long second, nobody in that wagon did anything at all. They were handlers of the most feared war stock in the sector, and the wild thing that war stock had been bred from, generations back and never quite far enough, had just walked into their house, and you could see it in every line of them. Not one of them had ever planned for the food chain to run in that direction. Corvath turned for the skimmer and started shouting orders, and to his credit the orders were the right ones: recall codes, fire teams, the heavy poles. But the skimmer held 4, and there were 9 of them, and the wagon would take 20 minutes to raise the hold across rough flats, and I could do the arithmetic on what 20 minutes meant for a nursery pen with its gate beast down as well as anyone there. The hound had already left my gate. He was standing out past the wagon at the edge of the track, head up for the first time all morning, reading the wind off the ridge, and the ridge wind was carrying something to him that I couldn't smell and didn't want to. He stood there a moment, all that gray-muzzled wreckage of him squared up and 20 years younger, and then he turned his head and looked back at me. Straight at me, the way he had the first night at the edge of my light, measuring. Yeah, I said. I set the coffee down on the porch rail. Give me a minute to get my coat. I rode in the cull wagon. In the stock cage meant for the hound because it was that or stay home, and Corvath had taken the skimmer with his 3 senior handlers and left the rest of us to follow across the flats. Nobody invited me. Nobody stopped me either. Tessick had looked at the hound loping easy alongside the wagon, keeping pace with the team without appearing to spend anything to do it, and then looked at me climbing into the cage with my coat and my old service torch and the long-handled fence pliers. And he had made a decision that probably violated 9den regulations, which was to say nothing at all. He follows you, Tessick said, over the rattle. It wasn't a question, but it wanted to be one. No, I said, we're going the same direction. There's a difference, and you'd better learn it before we get there. Denhold Carruth came up out of the flats the way it always did, like a fortress that had been told it was a farm. 12 meters of wire and plate wall, watch lamps, the long low pen barns laid out in rows behind it. I had seen it 100 times from the track on market days. I had never seen its main gate standing open with nobody in the gatehouse, and smoke coming up thin and wrong from somewhere inside, and the sound rolling out of it across the ash, that high saw-toothed yammering that every man who has ever lived on a frontier knows in the base of his spine. Vark. A lot of Vark. The wagon pulled up short of the gates and the team refused, flat refused, screaming in their harness, and that told you too. Even the dray stock knew what was inside. The yard past the gates looked like a battle had been fought by one side only. A watchtower lamp was down and burning in a spreading pool of its own oil. A transport sled lay on its side with its load of feed thrown 20 meters. There was a dead Vark by the inner gate, my first look at one up close in years, and it was bigger than I remembered, rangy and slab-shouldered. More wolf than anything else if a wolf could be built by somebody who hated you. And 20 meters past it there was a dead Vethrek, one of the young prime stock, its harness still on. The harness was the detail I didn't like. It had died restrained, fighting something its handlers had trained it never to fight without permission. And there were Hiren everywhere, and that was the worst of it, because they were the finest beast handlers in the sector, and they were doing nothing. They stood on the sled, on the gatehouse stair, in doorways, clutching poles and recall rigs, and the yard between them was a no-man's land they would not cross. Their stock was loose. The scatter of the breach had thrown panicked young Vethrek all through the hold. I could see 3 from where I stood, one pacing the wall in a wide, ugly figure 8, one backed into the angle of the pen barn with its lips off its teeth, one just standing in the open shaking. And somewhere deeper in, where the smoke was, the Vark were singing to each other among the pens. Corvath was up on the gatehouse stair with a recall rig in his fists, broadcasting the come-home tones, and the tones were doing nothing because recall codes are training, and training is the first thing terror eats. The hound walked in through the open gates of the den hold he had been bred in, sentenced in, and culled from, and stopped in the middle of the yard, and stood there. The pacing Vethrek saw him first. It came off the wall in a rush, fast the way the young ones are fast. All that bred-for-war machinery lit up with panic and looking for anything to spend itself on, and it came at the nearest standing figure, which was the hound, which meant it was also coming at me, because I was walking beside him with my fence pliers like a fool. I heard Tessic shout. I heard a pole charge whine somewhere behind me, too far back to matter. The old hound didn't meet the charge. He stepped half across it, dropped his head, and made a sound I'd never heard him make in 8 months on my farm, short, low 2 notes, like a hatch ceiling. The young one's charge broke apart all at once, like a wave hitting a piling. It went from full gallop to a stiff-legged scramble, fetched up 6 feet from us with its head suddenly down and sideways, and stood there vibrating, caught between 3 kinds of terror. Easy now, I said to it. The same voice I'd used on the wire cutters, the same voice I use on the grazers in a storm. Nothing in it, just level. Nobody's chasing you. Stand a minute. It stood, 800 pounds of panicked war stock, 3 minutes off watching a vark kill its penmate, and it stood, ribs heaving, and looked from the old hound to me and back, and you could watch its machinery change gears. The hound held his posture. I worked it out later, what that posture was. Den sign, older than their training, the body language of a pack that has a center, and the young one's head came down the rest of the way, and it sidled, stiff and ashamed looking, around behind us, and stayed there. The yard had gone very quiet. The handlers on the sled were not looking at the loose Vethrek anymore. They were looking at the gray-muzzled cull standing in the middle of their yard with a human at his shoulder, and I knew enough Hiran faces by then to read what was on them, and what was on them was a thing none of them had been issued any procedure for. Corvath came down the gatehouse stair 2 at a time. "Get that human out of the yard," he said to nobody who moved. "This is a den hold under breach protocol. He has no standing, no clearance, no." "The nursery pens," I said. Where? It was Tessic who answered. He pointed past the burning lamp oil, down the long alley between the pen barns into the smoke. "East row, last barn. There's a holding wall, and the gate beast is down at the door. 40 pups inside this season's whole whelping. Beastmaster, the vark are between us." "And I know where the vark are," Corvus snapped. "We hold the yard, we restore recall. We form a pole line and advance in order. That is the protocol. The stock is replaceable." "The 40 pups," I said, "is not stock. I'll give the Hiran in that yard this much." Not one of them agreed with him out loud, and not one of them disagreed either, and that silence had a shape, and the shape leaned my way. The old hound was already moving, not at the alley, along the line of the pen barns, head swinging, taking a census. He stopped at the young one backed into the barn angle, the one with its lips off its teeth, and stood side onto it, plainly bored until its lips came down. He passed the one that was just standing and shaking and bumped it with his shoulder as he went by, hard, like a sergeant cuffing a recruit, and it shook itself all over and fell in behind him. 20 meters of yard, and he had 2 of them at his heels. By the alley mouth, he had 4. None of it looked like magic. It looked like the oldest work there is. Somebody who knows the job walking through a room full of people who've forgotten theirs, collecting them. He stopped at the alley mouth, where the smoke went back between the barns and the vark song came down it like water through a pipe, and he looked back at me again. "Yeah," I said, and went to him, human crane. Corvath's voice cracked across the yard, and there was something new under the fury in it. Later I'd find the word for it. The word was dread, and it wasn't dread of the vark. If you go down that alley, the den takes no responsibility for what becomes of you. "That's all right," I said. It never took any for him either. We went down the alley, an old man, a culled hound, and 4 shaking adolescent war beasts who had decided, on no authority anyone could cite, that the safest place in the worst hour of their lives was behind a gray muzzle and a frayed human coat. I heard boots on the boards behind me, and it was Tessic, white around the eye plates, gripping a pole he held like he'd never charged one. And behind him, before the smoke closed over the alley mouth, I saw the rest of the handlers watching us go, and on the gatehouse stair above them, a tall old Hiran female in Denmatron's gray who had arrived from somewhere without my noticing, standing absolutely still, watching the hound the way you watch a grave open. The alley between the pen barns ran 200 meters east, and the smoke lay in it at chest height, drifting off a feed store that was smoldering rather than burning, and the vark song came and went through it from 3 directions at once. That trick of theirs, throwing the voice around the compass, I'd lost grazers to it for 6 years. It isn't noise, it's bookkeeping. They sing to mark what's where, And the song that morning said there were Vark north of us along the wall, Vark somewhere ahead among the east pens, and Vark already behind us in the yard margins we'd just left, sliding around the handler's frozen pole line like water around stones. "They're flanking the yard," Tessick said. He'd worked it out from my face, or maybe from the hound's ears. "They breached the wire to flank our yard. Wild animals don't." "They're not wild animals," I said. "They're a pack with a working command structure, in an enclosed space full of food and enemies, and somebody is running them. Keep your pole low and stop walking on your heels." The first one came at us 80 meters in, out of a gap between barns where a drainage cut went under the wall, came low and silent, the song stopping just before, which is the only warning their kind ever gives. It had picked me. They always pick the human we read as the slow one. It was wrong by a margin of about 4 feet, which was the distance the old hound covered sideways while I was still turning my head. I will not tell you it was a long fight, because it wasn't, and the Hiran war ledgers that later wanted it to be one were lying for good reasons of their own. There was an impact that I felt through the ground, one terrible compound sound of two big animals deciding something at maximum speed, and then the Vark was on its back in the drainage cut with its throat still its own property, barely, and the old hound was standing over it with his teeth half an inch from the artery, not biting, holding. The Vark went still the way a clock stops, and the hound let it up, let it scramble away down the cut and under the wall, marked and ruined and alive, carrying the news. "Why," Tessick said, unsteadily, "why didn't he finish it?" "Because the news is worth more than the kill. I'd seen it done with a knife once, on a boarding action, by a master sergeant from Yari. Send one back broken, it tells the rest what the price is. He's negotiating, move." The 4 young Vethrek behind us had bunched at the contact, panic trying to come back up in them like flood water, and the hound came back through them at a flat, unhurried walk, touching noses, leaning on the shakios 1-2 seconds apiece, and the floodwater went down. By the time we moved again, there were 5. A new one had come down off a feed shed roof where it had been crouched the whole time, watching, and folded itself into the back of our little column as if ashamed of the roof. The nursery barn sat at the end of the east row with its back to the outer wall, long and windowless, plate and timber, built like everything Hiran to stop the inside getting out rather than the outside getting in. The gate beast lay across its doorway. Gate beasts are the old career soldiers of a den hold, Vethrek too scarred and too set for line work, posted to doors for the last years of their service, and this one had died exactly on its post with 3 Vark dead around it in a fan, and the door behind it was scored to bare metal a foot up, but it had held. The old hound stopped at the body. He stood over it a moment with his nose just touching the gray-shot fur of its shoulder, and I'd swear before any court you like that the 5 young ones went quiet behind us, all at once, the same way. Then he stepped over it and put his back to the door, facing out, and looked at me, and the look said as plain as a work order, "This is the ground. Fix the rest." Inside, when Tessick got the codes through, was 40 pups worth of noise packed into a holding pen built for calm, a moving carpet of them, fist-sized heads and outsized feet, this season's whole whelping for the largest war-stock den on the planet, shrieking their small saw-toothed shrieks because they could smell the dead outside the door and the smoke under it. 2 den aunts were in with them, elderly Hiran females of the nursery caste, armed with feed paddles, standing their ground with the grim arithmetic of someone who knows exactly how little a feed paddle is worth. When the door opened on a human of all the shapes in the world, the elder of the 2 pointed her paddle at me like a saber. "He's with the gray one," Tessick said, which was not an explanation, and was also apparently the only one needed, because the paddle came down. We worked fast, because the song outside was thickening toward the east wall. I had the den aunts haul feed sacks while Tessick and I dragged pen dividers across the inner door. Building a second wall of Vark would have to come through slow and head first. I sent the shakiest 2 of our young Vethrek inside the barn itself, into the space between the doors, partly to plug the gap, mostly because a job is the best cage for panic, and standing between 40 screaming pups and the bad sound is the oldest job their blood knew. They took to it like they'd been issued it in writing. I put the other 3 on the corners of the barn outside, where the hound placed them, and that I watched with care because he did place them, walking each one to its ground and standing with it until it understood, a low, fast mutter of den sign between them, and the 3rd one he moved twice, 6 feet left, like a man not happy with where the rifle pit was dug. "You see what he's building," I said to Tessick, "a perimeter. He's building a den. Watch where he keeps the soft side." Every position fed back toward the doorway, toward the pups, toward the place he'd chosen to stand. There are armies that pay men like me a pension for 30 years and never teach them to lay a defense that clean. The handlers found us in early afternoon. They came down the alley in proper order, 12 of them in a pole line with Corvath at the center, and they arrived at a nursery barn that was no longer the den hold's problem to solve. Corners manned, approaches cleared, feed shed roof claimed by a sixth young Vethrek that had simply shown up over the wall of noise some time past, midday, and been assigned a height advantage. Corvath stopped at the edge of all of it, and I watched him take inventory, and I watched the inventory go down into him like swallowed glass. His scattered stock recovered, his pole line unnecessary, his breach contained by a cull and a dirt farmer. This position is irregular, he said finally. It's irregular, I agreed. It's also the only part of your hold the Vark haven't walked through this morning. You can stand on it or you can stand somewhere else. A muscle moved in his jaw under the plate. He turned to deploy his line anyway, to fold our work into his command and rename it protocol, and that was the moment the old hound, without moving from the doorway, made the sound again. The two-note one, the hatch ceiling, not at the Vark, at the pole line. 12 trained handlers of Denhold Caruth stopped at an audible line in the air drawn by an animal their own ledger had expired, and stood there, poles half raised, looking at it, looking at me, and not 1 foot crossed the mark. The old hound held the doorway and looked them over with the dead-level patience of a sergeant of the watch confronted with somebody's nephew, and what his whole gray frame said in any language ever made was, "This den has a center and you are not it, and you may approach in a manner suited to that arrangement, or you may keep the alley." It was Tessic who broke the silence. He laid his pole on the ground, laid it down flat deliberately in front of everybody, and walked across the line and came and stood with us. "First leash Tessic," Corvath said, with the kind of softness that's worse than shouting. "Note him." "Note me," Tessic said. His voice shook and held. "I stand where the stock stands, Beastmaster. The stock is decided." And behind Corvath, where the alley met the last of the smoke, I saw the Denmatron again, the tall old female in gray, who had followed the pole line down on foot the whole way and watched all of it happen. She said nothing. She was looking at the doorway, at the gray muzzle over the dead gate beast, at the old human leaning on the jamb beside it, and she had the stillness of someone doing very long division in her head and getting an answer she had been told all her life was impossible and checking it again. The Denmatron's name was Saraveth, and she ran Denhold Caruth the way a keel runs a ship, from underneath, without commentary. She crossed the hound's line in the middle of the afternoon, alone, on foot, with her hands empty and in sight, and she did it correctly. Slow, angled, eyes soft, every step asked for. The old hound watched her come the whole way and led her. There was history in that letting. I learned later she had been a nursery cast aunt herself 50 years back, before she was anything else, and that K7 Echo had been one of hers, a whelp of the 17th line, in a season nobody else at the hold was old enough to remember. "Human crane," she said. Her translator was an old model, and it left her voice rough at the edges instead of polishing it, which suited her. "Tell me what you need to hold this barn until the wire's closed." "Water for the pups before sundown," I said. "Meat for the 6 outside, working stock eats or it stops working. Your wire crews kept off the east wall. The pack reads movement up there as a push, and they'll answer it. And keep the poles out of my yard. The young ones have 1 panic left in them today, and I'm saving it. You'll have it." She paused, and the pause had weight. "The protocol said the breach was to be held at the yard. The protocol writes off the east row in a multiple incursion event. I wrote that protocol." "Protocols are what you write when you can't be everywhere," I said. "Nothing wrong with yours. It just didn't know him." She looked at the doorway for a long moment. "No," she said, "we none of us did," and went back up the alley to her wire crews. And from that hour, the supplies came down to us like the barn was the capital of something. The probe came at dusk, the way I'd told Tessic it would, because dusk is when the light lies and a defense shows its seams. They came over the east wall in 2 places at once, 4 and 3 quiet. The song shut off entirely, and the corners answered the way the old hound had built them to. The roof sentry saw the first heads on the wall and gave 1 short bark, a sound with coordinates in it, and the corner pairs shifted like a gun turret traversing. No chase. That was the discipline I would never have gotten into them, and he had laid in. With an afternoon of leaning and muttering, nobody chases. The line bent at the contact points, met the rush head-on in the choke between the barn and the wall, and held it there, all noise and teeth and no ground given, until the Vark arithmetic, and they are always doing arithmetic, came up red, and they poured back over the wall the way they'd come. They left 1 behind, dead at the choke, brought down by the corner pair on the north angle. We took 1 cost for it. The youngest of the 6, the one that had come off the feed shed roof in shame, had taken a raking cut along the ribs, long but shallow, and it stood after the contact shaking in the settling dark, bleeding and trying not to show it, exactly like every 19-year-old in every after-action I've ever stood. What happened next is the part the handlers told afterward in the holds and the markets, more than the breach itself, More even than what came on the last night, and I've given up correcting the way they tell it. I got my kit. I sat down on a feed crate beside a bleeding adolescent war beast, in the open, in the dusk, and I cleaned the cut and I stitched it. 11 stitches by hand lamp, talking the whole time about nothing, about my fence line, about a corporal I'd known who took worse from a galley hatch, about how the meat ration was coming and it had earned the big share. The youngster stood for all 11, shaking the whole time, its teeth 4 inches from my wrist the way another set of teeth had been once, in the gray end of winter. The part the handlers could not get over was none of that. It was that halfway through, the old hound left the doorway, left his post for the only time in 3 days, and came and lay down across my boots while I worked. 800 pounds of him, settling on my feet like a tarp thrown over a generator, facing the youngster, reading it, telling it something. Tessic stood holding the hand lamp for me, and I heard him stop breathing for a second when the hound came over, and then start again, slow. "We are taught," he said, very quietly, "from the first leash, that a Vethrek's blood ground is death, that when one bleeds, you clear the area and send the rig team in armor. There are handlers of 30 seasons who have never touched one's open wound." He moved the lamp to follow my hands. "What do you have that we don't?" "Nothing," I said, and tied off the last stitch, and the youngster turned its head and pushed its hot, ugly muzzle once against my shoulder, hard enough to rock me the way they do to a den mate, and somewhere in the dark a couple of the handlers watching from the alley mouth made a sound like prayer with the air taken out of it. I'm just not lying to him about anything. They always know. That's the whole trick, son. There's no trick. Corvith came back at full dark, and he came back with hardware. Fear rigs, the handlers called them, control collars from the hold's old inventory, the kind the den academies had been phasing out for a generation, that put a current into the big nerve clusters and turned a war beast's own body against it. He came down the alley with 6 handlers he'd picked for loyalty over sense, carrying rigs for our 6 young ones, and his logic was sound the way a bad order is always sound from one step inside it. The stock outside the nursery was unsecured. Unsecured stock in a breach is a weapon lying in the open, and protocol said collar it or pen it before the next assault. "They're holding your perimeter," I said. I'd gotten up off the crate. "They've held it since noon. They took blood for your pups at dusk and stood after. Put current into them now, and you'll finish what the Vark started this morning. They are den property in an unsecured state, bonded to a human with no standing and a cull with no line." His voice was level and loud at once, pitched past me, to his 6, to the dark, to the version of this night that would get reported. "This hold ran on order for 200 years before either of you walked into it. Rig them. I'll tell you what a fear rig sounds like when it charges. A thin rising whine, like a mosquito the size of a grievance, and every animal in that yard knew the sound from the inside. The 6 young ones came apart from it, not at the rigs, at the memory, the stitched one's panic coming up its throat in a saw-edge moan, the corner pair's breaking posture, 3 days of discipline sloughing off them in 3 seconds. And the whole defense I'd watched an old animal build, with his shoulders and his patience began to slide toward wreck, while the Vark song out past the wall rose up, interested in the change. 2 things happened. The first was that the handler nearest the stitched youngster, one of Corvith's 6, rig raised, fully committed, got hit from the side, not by teeth, by mass, the old hound crossing the dark like a closing door, taking the Huron off his feet and out from under his own mistake, half a second, before the youngster's panic finished becoming a lunge that would have opened him collar to plate. The hound put the handler down in the dirt, flat, pinned under one forepaw the size of a dinner plate, and held him there, unmarked, untorn, alive, screamingly aware of the inventory of his own throat, while the youngster's lunge crashed past through the space where he'd been standing and spent itself against a feed crate. He saved a Huron, Corvith's own. Everybody saw the order of events. Everybody saw the rig still charged in the man's hand, and where the teeth weren't. The second thing was quieter, and it ended the night. Denmatron Saraveth came down the alley with 2 wire crew lamps behind her, took in the yard, the pinned handler, the rigs, the moaning youngster, the wreck of the defense reassembling itself shakily around the greyhound's returning bulk, and said one sentence in Huron, flat as a slammed ledger, that Tessic's collar caught and threw me in the dark. "Beastmaster Corvith, hand the rigs to the wire crew, and your authority over this row to me, and consider on your walk back that the cull list bearing your seal is the only thing in this hold tonight that has not yet been wrong." The night went quiet after that, the way a front line goes quiet, which is to say it lied. I sat against the nursery door with my coat collar up against the ridge wind, and the old hound sat beside me with his ears doing slow traverses of the dark, and we listened to the Varksong move along the east wall, north to south and back, patient as a tide measuring a seawall. Inside the barn, the pups had finally gone down, stacked 3 deep against the inner divider in a heap you could have warmed a house off. The 2 den ants slept in shifts. The one awake, the elder, the one who'd aimed the feed paddle at me, had taken up a station where she could watch me through the door gap, and somewhere past midnight she pushed a tin mug of the handler's ration broth through it without a word, which in the nursery cast language was roughly a medal. Tessic didn't sleep. He sat on the feed crate cleaning the gash-stitched youngster's blood off my pliers, over and over, long past clean. The 17th line, he said. Eventually. K7 Echo's line. They were the hold's best for 40 years. Gate beasts, line anchors, the breeding spine of half the prime stock in the sector. He turned the pliers over. The line was discontinued before I was leashed. They said it had gone heavy, slow, old-fashioned. The new doctrine wanted speed off the mark, scoring drive, point-kill numbers, things that measure. He looked at the old shape beside me, gray muzzle up into the wind. There's no test on the leash exams for what he did at the corners today. I looked. There's no word for it on the forms. The nearest box is handler-dependent behavior, and it's marked as a fault. It would be, I said. Armies do that too. Every generation, some office discovers war is a mathematics problem and starts culling everything it can't put a number on. Then the weather comes, and everybody stands around astonished that the numbers won't hold a wall. I drank the broth. What they cut him for is the only thing standing between your whelping season and the ridge tonight, son. Write that on a form. He was quiet a while. Then the handlers are calling him something, since the stitching. It started with the wire crew, and I heard the yard guards take it up at the watch change. He said the heron first, 3 clipped syllables, then let the collar carry it over. Gray muzzle, they don't use his designation anymore. Corvith corrected 2 of them and it made it worse. It would, I thought. You can't cull a name. I must have slept an hour, because the hound woke me, not with sound, with stillness. The change in him came through the door at my back like a drop temperature. False dawn, the flats the color of gunmetal, and the song had stopped. All of it. Northeast, the ridgeline. A Vark pack at full strength sings its bookkeeping all night, every night. Silence wasn't peace. Silence was the books being closed before a withdrawal, or an audit. That was when I finally saw the alpha. It stood on the east wall itself, on the walkway, where the wire crews wouldn't go until daylight, must have come up one of the drainage cuts. Must have been inside our outworks half the night, unhurried, learning us. Vark run rangy. This one had mass on the frame as well. A third again bigger than the one the hound had ruined in the alley, with a hide gone pale as ashburn along the shoulders and one eye clouded white. And it was not looking at the pens or the meat or the handler's lamps. It was looking at the doorway, at the old hound, at me. The 2 of us, particularly, sorting us from everything else in the hold, the way you'd sort the only other literate men in a room. The old hound came up off his haunches and walked out into the open ground between the barn and the wall and stood, and the 2 of them regarded each other across 60 meters of gray light for the length of 10 slow breaths. No display, either side, no noise. 2 professionals reading each other's records. Then the alpha turned, dropped off the outside of the wall and was gone, and the song started up again far out on the flats as if a switch had been thrown. It came to count us, I said to Sarah Veth an hour later, in the gatehouse, with the morning ration going around, and Corvith standing at the map table with his jaw wired shut on his own ruin. It's been a counting operation since the breach. Your wire didn't fail, matron. It was opened. The drainage cuts were dug out from the outside over weeks, under the song, while your watch logged the noise as seasonal. The first push scattered your prime string and showed it the yard. The dusk probe priced our corners. Last night it walked its own ground survey while we watched the walls we'd already built. I put my finger on the map on the nursery row. It isn't raiding for meat. It's a war leader with a grown pack in a burn season with the high country emptying out, and it has found one fat defended valley with a food supply that breeds. It wants the hold. The pups are just the part it can carry. Wild Vark do not take holds, Corvith said to the table. Neither do culls hold nurseries, I said. It's a year for new doctrine all around. Sarah Veth stood over the map a long time. The morning light came through the gatehouse slits and you could see how old she actually was, and how little it had ever been allowed to matter. The relief column from Denhold Vasca is 4 days out, she said. The wire crews can close the breaches by dark, but the cuts under the wall are theirs, not ours. We'd be sealing it inside with us as much as out. Human Crane, you've read this animal better than my ledgers have. Tell the table what it does next. It comes tonight or it doesn't come at all, I said. It spent 3 days buying information, and it knows relief is moving. Packs read road dust better than we read each other's mail. Tonight, at the dark of the wind turn, everything it has, at the one place its whole operation has been pointed since the first wire went. I didn't have to touch the map again. Everybody in the gatehouse was already looking at the east row. Then we moved the whelping, Corvith said. Wagons at dusk, the pups crated, the prime stock harnessed as escort, run the west track to the market depot. The hold can be retaken. The breeding season cannot. He'd recovered his footing overnight. This was his ground, logistics, the movement of property, and the plan came off him crisp and costed. The cull stock and the human strays stay as rearguard. Acceptable losses against the line stock saved. The gatehouse was quiet. It was on the numbers a real plan. That's the thing about men like Corvath that nobody warns you about. They're not stupid. They're only ever missing one column. You'll lose the wagons on the flats in the dark to a mobile pack that owns the ground. I said, and every handler in this room knows it, and that's not even the problem. The problem is your escort. Harness the prime string tonight and ask them to walk away from a nursery they can hear, with the thing from the wall out singing in the dark. They broke once this week already, Beastmaster. The second break is always cheaper. I looked around the table, at the faces, at the matron. You don't outrun a siege with the besieger watching you pack. You break it. It is bringing its whole strength to a single point of our choosing. Tonight, onto ground, an anchor line Vethrek has spent 3 days preparing. Your Bred for doctrine has been praying for a fight this honest for 200 years. Stand and meet it. On the advice of a human grazer farmer, Corvath said, and the instincts of an expired cull. On the only 2 things in this hold, Saraveth said, that the enemy has personally inspected and declined to fight. She straightened off the map table, and her old rough voice went around the gatehouse like a keel taking weight. The whelping stays, the hold stands, wire crews to the cuts, meat to the corners, and every leash in Caruth takes positions tonight where Grey Muzzle puts them. A beat, and her eyes cross Corvus like a blade being shown, not drawn. All of them, Beastmaster. Yours too. Corvath made one more move before the matter passed out of his hands, and the hold still talks about how it ended, so I'll set it down straight. An hour after the council broke, while the wire crews were drawing meat and cable for the east row, the transport wagons rolled out of the motor shed and staged along the west alley. 6 of them, stock cages rigged, ramps down. Contingency staging, the order said, under the Beastmaster's seal, which was still his seal until a court said otherwise. The prime string to be loaded and held ready, in case the night went against us. Read one way, it was prudence. Read the other way, it was the evacuation he'd been refused. Dressed in different paper, with the prime stock. The hold's bloodline wealth, his office's whole account. Boxed and wheeled and pointed west away from the fight, and the east row left to the irregulars. Everybody read it the other way. Nobody could quote a regulation against it. I didn't go to watch the loading. I had a choke point to furnish and no standing to spend. Tessic went because his leash assignment still ran through the Beastmaster's office. And Tessic told me what the West Alley saw. And the West Alley was crowded enough with witnesses that no 2 tellings have ever disagreed on the substance. They loaded the prime string by the book, harness leads, calm tone rigs, the senior handlers walking each animal up its ramp. 22 head of the finest war stock on the planet, glossy and papered, and worth more than my farm and every farm I've ever seen, walked up those ramps the way they'd been trained to since their first leash. And then, with the cages still open and the manifest being signed, the wind turned for a moment, just a breath of it, a little early eddy ahead of the wind turn, coming over the pen barns from the east, and it carried what the east row smelled like down the west alley. Smoke and bloodground and varkmark and pups. The whole ugly honest arithmetic of the thing the wagons were being staged to drive away from. The hold's best stock came back down the ramps. Not in a break. That's the part the handlers couldn't put in any box they owned. No panic, no scatter, nothing the manuals had a procedure for stopping. The lead animal of the string, a big line-bred female with campaign clips on both ears, the kind of Vethrek they put on recruiting posters, simply turned in her cage before the door swung, walked back down the ramp through the hands of 3 handlers as if their leads were rein, and set off east up the alley at a flat working trot. And the string followed her, all of it. 22 head of prime stock filing past the stage wagons and the open cages and the Beastmaster of Den. Hold Caruth in a quiet, total unhurried column out of the west alley and across the yard and down the east row, where they arrived in front of the nursery barn and stood, and the old hound came off the doorway and walked their line once, nose and shoulder, 2 seconds apiece, the foreman taking on the new crew, and then he put them where he wanted them, and the east row's crescent got 22 head deeper, and that was the hold's evacuation. The senior handlers stood in the west alley holding empty leads. Then they laid the leads on the wagon beds and walked east after their stock, which is what a handler is for, and Corvath was left with 6 staged wagons, a signed manifest, and nothing on the planet willing to be cargo. Saraveth never said a word about it. She didn't have to. The stock had voted the way she'd tell the court by firelight a night later, and every vote had walked past his office to be counted. The Varks sent their answer to all of it at midday. 1 animal alone in the open, in full light, and it was the one the old hound had ruined in the alley on the first morning, moving stiff on the marked shoulder, and it came across the flats to the east wire slow and deliberate with its head level. A thing Vark do not do, because Vark do not spend daylight or show a lame flank unless the showing is the message. It stopped at the wire, out of pole range, and stood there looking down the choke at our works, at the funnels and the revetments and the crescent and the gray muzzle in the doorway for a long unhurried minute. Pricing it all again one last time on the Alpha's behalf, the hold watched from the walls and nobody breathed loud. The old hound walked down the choke to the wire and stood across from it, 2 meters and one fence between them, and gave it nothing. No posture, no sound, none of the den sign the young ones got. Just stood, square on the bad leg, and let it look at him and look back. The offer was still the same offer from the alley, asked and answered, leave and keep what's left. The lame one held his eye a moment longer, and then it turned and went back across the flats the way it had come, slower than it needed to, and Tessic, beside me on the wall, let his breath out. It came to see if the line was real, he said. Before they spend the pack on it tonight. It came to see if we'd lie about it. I said, same thing. He doesn't lie, and now they know the price is posted. I put my hat back on. That's the last courtesy of the negotiation, son. Everything after this is collection. Let's go look at the choke walls one more time. We spent the daylight building the fight we wanted, instead of the one we'd been offered. I've laid defenses on 4 worlds, and I never had a better afternoon's work out of any garrison than I got out of Denhold Caruth that day, because for the first time since the breach, the whole hold was doing something instead of standing post against its own imagination. The shape of it was the old hound's, and I mean that literally. He walked the east row through the morning with me and Tessic trailing him like surveyors, and where he stopped, we built. The drainage cuts the Vark had opened, we left open 2 of them, the 2 that fed into the choke between the nursery barn and the wall, and the wire crews sealed every other way in until the whole east end of the hold funneled like a lobster trap. You do not close the door on a stronger enemy. You choose which door, and you furnish the room. The handlers worked in their shirt sleeves alongside the young Vethrek, hauling pen dividers, sinking posts, stacking feed crates into revetments, and somewhere in the middle of that day, the fear went out of the work. I watched a wire crew Hiren, broad as a hatch cover, get knocked flat by the stitched youngster turning too fast with a crate harness on, and the yard held its breath, and the youngster put its head down and licked the side of his face, one enormous apologetic swipe, and the Hiren lay there a second and then laughed, the first Hiren laugh I'd ever heard, like gravel going down a chute, and the work went on. 3 days before, that same man would have called the rig team in armor. Saraveth found me at midday at the gate beast's grave. The handlers had buried it at dawn beside the door it died on. Nursery cast came out and sang the den line over the mound, all 17 generations, and I'd gone to stand there a minute with my hat off, because some habits outlive their wars. You should know what you've been standing next to, she said. She had a ledger under her arm, the old bound kind, and she opened it to a page she'd marked. K7 Echo, whelped here, 17th line. Anchor trained under the old doctrine, the last season we taught it. 41 recorded line actions at holds and convoy work across 2 sectors. 11 seasons a gate beast at the Southern Depot after the line was discontinued. Retired unsold. Listed for cull on the standard schedule. Age and lameness under seal of the Beastmaster's office. She turned the page. The lameness assessment is initialed by an apprentice. The animal escaped the cull transport at the river crossing, which the office recorded as stock lost, presumed dead. The office did not look hard. The transport was overweight that day by 1 entry, and the fee for a clean manifest is less than the fee for a hunt. She closed the book. He is not a stray you fed, human crane. He is the last working graduate of everything this hold used to know. When he stood down your charge in the yard, the den sign he used, there is no one left on the leash rolls young enough to have been taught it and old enough to remember it. They are learning it off him now, the young ones, the way you learn a language in your grandmother's kitchen. Whatever happens at the wind turn tonight, that has already happened. Korvath's office culled the syllabus, and it walked home with a human. He's not done teaching, I said. No. She looked at the mound and the door, and the old gray shape lying in front of it with one ear up. Matron to matron, I came to ask him to forgive the hold. I find the nearest I can come to it is asking you. He doesn't deal in it, I said. Neither do I. We're old. The list of people who were wrong about us is long, and we lost the habit of keeping it. Feed him after, matron. That's the whole bill. The wind turn came 2 hours past full dark, the ridge wind dying and the cold flats air coming back the other way, and the song came with it, and this time the song did not stay out on the flats. It came in close on 3 sides, big and layered and deliberately loud, and that was the first lie, because the loud song had gaps in it where voices should have been, and the gaps were already moving quiet toward the drainage cuts. The old hound stood in front of the nursery door. In the center of the crescent he'd spent 3 days building, 6 young Vethrek at the corners and angles, rested and fed. The prime string laid in a second line along the row behind them, harness off by his placing. 12 handlers with poles at the revetments. Wire lamps shuttered down to nothing, and he made one sound up into the dark, 2 notes, the hatch closing, and the whole east row shut its mouth and waited. I will tell the fight the way it happened, which is faster than the way the hold sings it now. The first wave came through the 2 open cuts at a flat sprint, 8 and 9, expecting the dark and the panic of 3 nights before, and got the trap sprung instead, lamps unshuttered all at once into their eyes. The choke walls funneling them shoulder to shoulder into ground where their speed was spent against angles, and the corner pairs hit them from both flanks the way they'd been placed to, and the pole line held its mark behind, and nobody chased. The arithmetic went red for them in under a minute. They poured back out through the cuts, less 3. The second wave was the real one, and it didn't use the cuts at all. The wall came alive overhead. They'd stacked themselves a ramp of their own dead, and the sled wreckage along the outside through the dark hours, patient as engineers, and they came over the top in a single silent file and dropped inside the trap behind our corners between the crescent and the barn. Inside everything, 11 of them. The prime string rose out of the dark of the second line and met them in the open row, 22 head of line-bred warstock, finally given the honest fight 200 years of doctrine had been praying for. And that fight was loud and short and never once in doubt. And the alpha came over last, unhurried, ash pale in the lamp spill, and dropped into the open ground before the nursery door like a verdict arriving, and the whole fight everywhere else in the row stopped mattering at once. What stood between it and the door was old. I was at the door itself, with Tessic and his pole on my left and the youngest stitched Vethrek pressed against my right leg, shaking and staying, and the old hound walked out to meet the alpha in the middle of the lamplight, and there was nothing in the books of 2 worlds that belonged in that circle with them. The alpha was bigger, younger by years that mattered. It had taken holds of its own kind apart. You could read the record on its hide, and it knew exactly what the gray thing in front of it was, because it had spent 3 nights pricing him. It tried him anyway. That's what command costs. The wall you priced still has to be paid, and the 2 of them met in the middle with a sound like a wagon going over, and I have watched champion stock fight in the market pits, and it was nothing kin to this. Pit fighting is argument. This was grammar. The alpha spent speed, and the old hound spent position. The alpha bought a grip on the gray shoulder and paid for it with the tendon the hound had been selling him at that price for 3 exchanges, and at the worst of it, with the 2 of them locked and grinding in the lamp spill and the gray off 4 buckling under him, the lame leg, the cull-listed leg, the apprentice-initialed leg, every young Vethrek in the crescent broke posture toward him at once, and the old hound, with an alpha's jaws in his shoulder, made the sound that meant hold the line, and they held it, and I will not hear it told otherwise. That was the moment the east row was won. Not the kill, the held line while he was down on 3 legs. There is no test for it on the leash exams. There is now a row in the war ledger. The alpha broke him backward against the feed crate revetment and came off him to finish it and put itself for one stride between the lamps and the nursery door, facing me. People ask what I was thinking, standing in a doorway in a frayed coat between a Vark war leader and 40 pups, and the honest answer is that I'd stopped being a separate thing to think with. I was the door. Behind me was the noise of everything small. Under my hand, flat against my leg, was the head of the stitched youngster, silent now, and out in the lamps, getting up off the crates on 3 legs and 1 ruin, was my neighbor. The alpha looked at me with its one clear eye, and I looked back, and I did not raise the torch or the pliers or my voice. Not these, I told it, level, the way you tell weather. Go home. It understood me or it didn't. What it understood past argument was the rest of the sentence, which arrived from its blind side at 800 pounds an old man's voice had just released. Because the hound had heard me too, and not these has an order of operations in any language. He took the alpha off its stride, and the crescent came in off the corners as one closing. Hand, 6 young anchor line students executing the oldest lesson of the discontinued syllabus onto the pale shoulders of the thing that had come to, grade them, and the lamplight went over once like a capsizing boat, and then there was a stillness with breathing in it. The old hound stood over the alpha the way he'd stood over the first one in the alley, jaws set at the artery, holding. Looking down into the clear eye with the patient gray arithmetic of 41-line actions, and what he was offering was the same contract as before, and the alpha, who was a war leader and could read a ledger, went still and took it. He let it up. It went over the wall slow bleeding, beaten in front of its whole strength. And the song that took the pack north off the flats that night was thin and short, the books closing for good, and we never saw a vark on the hold's ground again. Dawn came up over a hold that had stopped being afraid and hadn't yet worked out what to be instead. The costs got counted the way they always do, in the flat early light that doesn't flatter anything. 3 vark dead inside the wire from the first wave, 4 from the second, and the stack dead outside the east wall that their own kind had climbed. The hold would be a week burning and burying. On our side of the ledger, one handler with a forearm laid open at the revetments, taken to the infirmary arguing that he wanted to watch the yard instead. The stitched youngster with 2 new gashes to bracket my 11 stitches, standing guard on the nursery door with its chest out like it had invented doors. Pen dividers and feed crates wrecked across the whole east row, and the old hound. He would not lie down. That was the first fight of the morning. The alpha had cost him, the off-fore shoulder torn through the old lameness, a puncture under the jaw, a gouge along the ribs that reopened every time he turned, and he stood in front of the nursery door in the cold light with the blood-drying gray on, gray, swaying half a degree on the bad leg, on watch, because the watch hadn't been called off and nobody in 200 years had taught the 17th line assigned for the war is over. The hold's rig team came at him just after sunup, 4 handlers in treatment armor with a sled and a sedation pole, all according to protocol, the protocol for a blood-grounded Vethrek being armor and distance and current. They got within 10 meters, and the old hound put his head around at them. And 10 meters is where that protocol stopped being in force at Denhold Caruth. "Put it down," I said to them. The pole, I meant. And the armor crew stood there holding their procedure in their hands while I walked into the blood ground their form said was death. Sat down on a cracked feed crate in front of the most decorated animal on the leash rolls of 2 sectors and said, "All right, you stubborn old wreck. Watch change, I've got the door." He looked at me a long moment. Then he lay down, folded down onto the cold ground with a sound like a house settling, put his ruined shoulder against my knee, and let out a breath he might have been holding since the river crossings, where a cull transport lost 1 entry off an overweight manifest. The Denons treated him. That detail matters to the hold now, the way these things come to matter afterward. Not the rig team, not the infirmary. The nursery cast came out with their kits in their slow hands, the 2 old females who had held the inside of the door for 3 days, and they cleaned and packed and sewed him in the open yard while I held his head, and the elder one worked with tears standing in her eye plates the whole time, because she was old enough to have known the 17th line when it was the pride of the hold, and her hands had probably been among the first that ever touched him. Halfway through, the pups got loose. The official account is that a divider inside the barn was knocked over in the cleanup. I was there. Nobody knocked it. 40 pups, 3 days pent, with the fear smell finally gone off the wind and every interesting thing in their world happening in the yard outside, will solve a divider, and they came out the door past the stitched youngster like a flood finding a failed seam, and the yard full of exhausted handlers froze solid, because loose pups in an unsecured yard was 4 separate emergencies in the manual, and the flood went where floods go, downhill to the lowest, warmest, most interesting point, which was the enormous gray ruin lying against my knee being sown. They swarmed him. There's no soldier's word for it. They came over his tail and up his flank and into the trench between his forelegs, fist-sized heads and milk teeth and outsized feet, gnawing his ears, falling off his ribs and climbing back, 3 of them fighting a war of their own in the warm angle of his bad shoulder, and the old hound, 41 line actions, 11 seasons a gate beast, 1 night off the worst fight on the ledger, lay there under the lot of them and let it happen with his eyes half shut, and the look on what showed of his face was the put-upon dignity of every grandfather on every porch in the history of either species. One of them, a runt with 1 black ear, I'd come to know it well, fell off his muzzle, rolled, fetched up against my boot, took hold of my trouser cuff and went to sleep mid-growl. The elder Denant looked at it and at me and made a note on her board. I found out later what the note said. It said, "Bonded, the handler stood around the yard watching 40 pups of the hold's whole future use a culled, gate beast and a human grazer farmer for a den floor, and Tessic told me months on, when he could say it without his voice going, that was the morning the doctrine actually changed at Caruth, not in the gatehouse, in the yard, at pup level, with everybody too tired to pretend the old categories were load-bearing. The relief column from Denhold Vasca arrived at midday, 4 days early, having force-marched on the breach reports, and I will keep the picture of their arrival the rest of my life. They came through the main gates in full war order, 60 handlers, a prime string of fresh Vethrek in line harness, heavy poles, a beastmaster at the front in parade plate, into a hold with its dead already buried, its walls already manned by shirt-sleeved wire crews, its yard occupied by a sleeping mountain of gray scar tissue wearing 40 pups and an old human, and its Vark problem already a smoke smudge going north up the ridgeline. The Vaska Beastmaster sat his mount in the gate for a slow 10 count, reading the yard the way you'd read a sentence in your own language with all the words in the wrong jobs. Then he asked the nearest wire crew handler, reasonably, who held the east row in the assault. The handler pointed at the pile. "Which one?" the Beastmaster said. "Yes," the handler said. "Corvith spent that afternoon in the records room, and I want to be fair to him one last time before the evening I have to tell next. He was not hiding. He was doing what his kind of man does in the hour after the weather proves him wrong, building the version of events where he wasn't." The breach response reframed as his delegation of authority. The nursery stand reframed as den stock performing under den training, irregular auxiliaries notwithstanding. The cull of K7 Echo reframed as the very policy that had hardened the survivors. It was good work. I've read it. The matron gave me a copy, afterward the way you'd give a man a souvenir of a storm he stood through. It might even have carried, in front of a sector board, on paper, at a distance. It did not carry in the yard at Denhold Caruth, because Saraveth convened the den court at sundown, in the open by the gate beast grave, with the whole hold standing and the Vaska column as witness. And a den court doesn't read reports. It calls what it can see. They lit the fire pans at the four corners of the yard as the light went, which I learned was as old as the holds themselves. Judgment is given where the stock can watch, because the stock cannot be lied to, and that evening proved the saying out in front of everybody. The handlers formed up by leash rank. The nursery cast stood at the barn door with the pups penned behind a mended divider, quiet for once. The 6 young Vethrek of the East Row Crescent put themselves, with no order given, in a loose arc behind a cracked feed crate near the front, because I was sitting on it, with the old hound lying bandaged at my feet, and 3 days had made that arrangement the fixed center of their map of the world, and no power present proposed to argue with them about it. Saraveth came out in full den matron's gray with the bound ledger under her arm and stood by the grave, and the hold went silent enough to hear the firepans breathe. "Denhold Caruth holds court," she said, the old collar throwing it rough across the yard. 3 matters, the breach, the stand, and the seal of the Beastmaster's office. She set the ledger down on the grave mound stone deliberately, like a weight on a scale. "Beastmaster Corvith Densarl, stand to the fire." And Corvith came out of the line in his capped tusks and his handler armor he no longer worked in, and walked to the front with his head up, because whatever else was missing in the man, nerve never was, and he passed within 4 feet of the old hound on his way to the firepans, and the hound lifted his gray head off my boot and watched him pass, and did not make a sound, and that silence followed Corvath to the fire like a creditor. The court took the breach first, and the breach acquitted itself quickly, because the wire logs and the drainage cuts told an enemy's story, not a negligent one. The hold had been out-engineered by a war leader, and Saraveth said so plainly and let the wire captain stand down unstained. That was shrewd, and it was also just, and it taught me something about her. She was not building a scaffold. She was balancing a ledger, and she meant every column to be true, because the column she was coming to last had to be unanswerable. The stand came second. She called it witness by witness, the second leash from the cull wagon, who testified to the gate of my farm and the 2 degrees of a kill posture coming down at 6 words from a human. The wire captain, to the corners and the choke, the denance, to the door held and the broth mug and the 11 stitches in the open dusk. The handler the old hound had taken to the ground, who stood to the fire with his throat unmarked and said, in front of his own rank, "I was the weapon in that yard. The cull disarmed me and spared me. Write it as I say it." And Tessic last, who laid out the 3 days flat and chronological and let them be enormous on their own, and finished with his pole still lying where he'd put it down, because he had never picked it back up, and said, "The forms give me no box for what held the East Row. I request the court name it so it can be taught." "The court will name it," Saraveth said. "Third matter, the seal. It was not the failure that broke Corvith. I want that understood, because the version they sing in the market rows now makes it the fight, and that flatters everybody and teaches nothing. Failure is weather. A den court knows it. What broke him was the manifest. Saraveth read it out herself, from the records his own office kept, the cull listing under his seal, the lameness assessment initialed by an apprentice who had never handled the animal, the transport ledger overweight by 1 entry at the river crossing, the loss recorded as presumed dead with no hunt logged, no fee paid, no verification sworn. And then in the silence the sentence she had been walking toward since the gatehouse map table. The office of the Beastmaster culled the last anchor of the 17th line on an apprentice's initials, lost him through a falsified manifest, and 3 seasons later raised charged fear rigs against the stock holding its own nursery, and was prevented from that error by the cull it had falsified. The hold did not fail, Beastmaster. The hold was failed. Answer. And Corvith, to the only credit left him, did not answer with the report. He stood at the fire a long moment with the whole hold watching, and the firelight moving on his capped tusks, and I think the report was in his mouth, and I watched him taste it and find out what it was made of. He looked at the yard, at the wire crews, at the Vasca column, at the arc of young Vethrek around a feed crate, at the gray ruin lying bandaged at an old human's feet with its chin back on its paws. And the yard looked back at him with one face, and that face was not angry. It was finished. There is no arguing with finished. The seal is the den's, he said finally, and his voice held, which cost him more than breaking would have. I return it. He unfastened it from his collar plate, the Beastmaster's seal of Caruth, den silver, older than him, older than her, and laid it on the grave mound stone beside the ledger, and Saraveth took it up and did the thing that I am told had been done only twice before in the hold's 200 years. She read his name off the leash rolls. Not cursed, not exiled. Read off. Struck from the column of those entitled to handle living stock, his rank cords cut at the knot by the eldest denaunt with her kit shears, his authority distributed back into the hands it had been gathered from. He would keep his quarters, his pension right, his name among the Hiran. He would never again hold a leash, sign a manifest, or stand in a yard with stock except as a man the stock outranked. They tell me that among his people there are deaths that cost less. He left the fire and walked the long way down the yard, past the whole hold, because the court requires it. The walk is the sentence, and the handlers turned their faces from him by rank as he passed, which is their form, and the stock did not turn away, which is the stock's, and was worse. The 6 young Vethrek watched him the whole way with their heads level, unblinking, the way the old hound had watched the prod poles at my gate a lifetime of 4 days ago. He had to pass our crate to reach the barracks row. He stopped. I did not expect it. Nobody did. And he looked down at the old hound for a moment with the firelight on the wreck of his career, and he said, in his own voice, with the collar off, words I had to ask Tessic for afterward. Herein is accounting language, Tessic told me. It doesn't translate clean. The nearest is, the column I could not see. I am the proof of it. It's from the breeding ledgers. It's what you write when a line shows a trait the tests had no row for. He paused. It's the closest thing the man's language has to an apology, and he spent it on the animal, not the court. The old hound watched him go with the same gray patience he'd spent on everything else that week, and then put his chin back on my boot. Whatever the 17th line keeps in the place where other creatures keep their grudges, it had been paid by the manifest, or it had never been kept at all. I've thought about it since. I think held grudges are a luxury of creatures who were never bred to hold doors instead. The court names the stand, Saraveth said, when the yard had settled, and she opened the bound ledger on the gravestone to a clean page, and the eldest denaunt brought the pen, and the whole of Denhold Caruth and the Vasca column, who would carry the page home in copies, which she had arranged with cold precision by holding court in front of them, heard the doctrine of the East Row entered into the war ledger of the hold under its new name, the gray muzzle line. She read the entry out as she wrote it, and I will not try to give you the whole of it from memory, but the bones were these, that an anchor holds ground not by mass but by being the fixed point that others' courage can take a bearing from, that a line which holds while its anchor is down is the proof the anchor was real, that the den sign of the old syllabus was to be recovered from the last animal who carried it and taught at every leash rank, and that the hold recognized, this clause she read slowly into the firelit quiet, while several hundred tons of assembled warstock and handlers listen, that an anchor need not be of the den's own blood, that the fixed point of the East Row, on the 3rd night of the breach, had been standing in a doorway in a frayed work coat, and the line had taken its bearing accordingly. Human crane, she said over the open ledger. The seal of the Beastmaster's office is in my hand and the office is empty. The court is advised that the stock of this hold has, by its own conduct, already voted. The den asks. Every face in the yard came around to the feed crate. The firepans breathed. Down by my boot, the old hound opened one eye, and I'd swear on my discharge papers there was humor in it. Matron, I said, I'm a grazer farmer. I've got fence wire down on my southern line, a barn roof wanting patching before the cold, and a neighbor who'll be off his feet 3 weeks at least, which means I'm doing 2 farms fence walks for a while on knees with no warranty left. I stood up and my knees made the point for me, and somewhere in the dark a handler failed to suppress the gravel chute sound, and I let it run around the yard and settle. I held the door for 3 days because it was my watch. I won't hold an office. But I'll tell you what I'll take if the den's asking. The den is asking. Send me my neighbor's students, I said. When the young ones are ready for what the forms have no box for, send them out to the flats. He'll be on my porch. We went home on the 5th morning, the old hound and I, on foot the way we'd come, because he refused the wagon with the simple dignity of refusing to notice it existed, and I wasn't going to ride while he walked. 15 kilometers across the Scarn Flats with the burn smoke finally washing out of the sky. Him on 3.5 legs and me on 2 bad knees. And it took us most of the day, and it was the best day's walking I've had on any world. The hold turned out to see us off. I don't mean a ceremony. The Huron had spent their ceremony at the fire pans. I mean, the wire crews stopped work along the wall as we passed under it, and the handlers came to the pen rails, and the nursery cast stood at the barn door with the pups roiling against the mended divider, and nobody said anything much, because there wasn't anything much that needed saying that hadn't been entered in the ledger. Tessic walked us to the gate. He had new rank cords. Sarah Veth had moved him up 2 leashes in 1 season, which had not happened at Caruth in living memory, and had assigned him the recovery of the old Gensign syllabus, which meant that his formal duty, written on a Hiron duty roster with a seal on it, was now to visit my farm and learn from my neighbor. He stood at the gate working up to something, and finally got it out. The first leash exams, he said, 11 years ago, I failed the temperament assessment the first time. The examiner wrote that I showed handler-dependent behavior, that I stood too close to the stock. He looked away, out at the flats. I memorized the correction. I have spent 11 years standing the regulation distance from every living thing in my care. I want you to know what it cost to put the pole down in the alley, human crane. And I want you to know it was the cheapest thing I ever bought. Son, I said the regulation distance is what they teach people, so the ones who never learn the work can supervise the ones who do. You stood where the work was. He noticed before I did. I shook his hand, the human custom, which he'd been practicing. You could tell he'd gotten the pressure almost right. Tuesdays, I said. We do fences on Tuesdays. Bring gloves. The old hound and I walked out of Denhold Caruth through the main gates, past the place where the cull wagon had stood at my fence with its empty cage a week and a lifetime before, and the last thing I heard from inside the walls was the pups, all 40 of them, singing their small saw-edged objection at being penned away from the going away of the 2 most interesting things in their world. He stopped once, at the rise where the track bends south, and looked back at the hold for a while, at the walls he'd been whelped inside, sentenced inside, and finally at the far end of the arithmetic, named inside, and I stood and let him take his time, and when he'd taken it, he turned south toward the farm and didn't look back again, and his ears were easy the whole way home. The fence wire on the southern line was down like I'd said. We fixed it Tuesday. Tessic brought gloves. I'd like to tell the ending the way the flats tell it now, because the flats have gotten hold of the story, and I no longer control it. The market rows at the depot sing a version where the alpha was the size of a hauler, and the human called lightning down the wire, and there is a Denhold 2 sectors over, I am reliably informed, where young handlers are taught with a straight face that the gray muzzle line was held by a human war chief of terrible renown, retired to the frontier to breed anchors for the holds. I met one of those handlers at the depot last cold season. He asked me, not knowing my face, whether I'd ever seen the war chief of the Scarn Flats. I told him the truth, that I'd seen an old farmer in a frayed coat asleep in a chair most afternoons, and the deadliest thing on that farm slept on the porch beside him and snored. The handler said that matched the songs exactly and went away satisfied. The Hiron are a more honest people than they're given credit for. They just count in a bigger column. Here is what actually happens on my farm these seasons, which is the only ending I can swear to. The young ones come out from the hold in 2s and 3s, on the duty roster, for what the ledger formally calls anchor instruction, and what actually happens is this. They walk my fence lines with the old hound at whatever pace his shoulder allows that day, and he teaches them the things the syllabus lost. How to be still, how to be the fixed point, how to put your body where the fear has to come through you to get to the soft side. And none of it looks like teaching, the same way none of what he did at the hold looked like magic. It looks like an old foreman walking a job with apprentices. Sometimes a grazer spooks at the wire, and a 600-pound adolescent war beast learns, by standing next to a gray muzzle that doesn't move, that not moving is a thing that can be done. That's the whole curriculum. Sarah Veth came out herself once to observe it, sat on my porch through an afternoon of it with a mug of my coffee going cold in her hand, and said at the end quietly, 200 years of doctrine, and the recovery program is an old man's fences. Then she filed a report recommending its expansion to 3 more holds, because that is who she is. The Stitch youngster, Brace I call him, over the Den Ant's objection that naming stock is irregular, an objection they lost the day I caught the eldest calling the black-eared runt by a Hiron milk name when she thought the yard was empty. Brace serves at the hold now, a line anchor in training, first of the new syllabus. He comes out with the Tuesday details and walks my southern wire like he's holding the east row, every time, And when he leaves, he pushes that hot, ugly head against my shoulder hard enough to rock me. 11 stitches worth of contract, renewed weekly. The black-eared runt never went back. The Denon's board said bonded, and the ledger has a row for that now, and she is asleep at the moment. As I write this, on the boot she claimed the morning after the long night, having grown into something the size of a yearling calf that still believes it fits on a boot. The hold calls her fostered. The truth is the 17th line adopted my farm, and the paperwork is still catching up and always will be. And the old hound sleeps on the porch. In the chairside spot he holds against all claimants, and his muzzle is white now instead of gray, and his shoulder tells the weather a day before the sky admits anything. The hold sent out their best rig surgeon last spring to look at the old wounds, and she examined him for an hour and packed her kit and told me, with the flat Hiran honesty I've come to bank on, that he was assembled out of scar tissue and spite and would likely outlast the both of us out of professional thoroughness. Some evenings when the wind turns and comes down off the ridge the cold way, carrying whatever it carries that I've never once smelled and never once doubted, he gets up out of the chairside spot and walks to the top of the porch steps and stands there, head up, reading the dark. And the young ones along the fence line, there are always a few now. The hold pretends it's the duty roster, and I pretend the meat shed empties itself. Come up off the ground without a sound and stand to their places, a loose crescent between the farmhouse and the night, taking their bearing off the fixed point on the porch the way the ledger says a line should. I don't get up anymore. I learned that from him, I suppose, or he confirmed what 30 years of watch rotations had started. You stand the watches that are yours, and you trust the line for the rest of them. They bred 1,000 war beasts behind that wire, and the ledgers priced everyone, and the one they threw away for the columns he couldn't fit in, walked home with an old man and held the door for all of them. The wind comes down off the ridge, and the crescent stands along my fence in the dark, and the great gray wreck at the top of my steps reads the night for whatever is out there owed accounting. Easy, I tell him, from the chair, when the wind's been read and found empty. Nothing out there tonight but weather. And he comes back and settles down against the chair with the sound of a house standing, an old soldier and an old soldier, and neither of us has ever once run from weather, and we are both too old to start.